What could make a woman crawl toward a killing wall of storm dust rather than let go of a secret that would change a rancher's whole life forever? Talila did, stumbling blind through air gone black as a mine shaft 300 yards from the rock line, where Rhett Calder fought to hold his own herd together, one arm locked over a leather-wrapped bundle she would rather have died than drop. Rhett did not know her name yet. He did not know she was Chiricahua Apache, or that the bundle crushed against her ribs was proof enough to hang 3 men and save the last spring her people had left to call their own, drunk from, since long before his kind had a name for this territory at all. He only knew that if he'd let his last 23 head of steer walk on without him, the way every sane instinct he owned was screaming at him to do, a woman would be dead within the hour, and he would spend the rest of his life unable to live with having let her. So he turned his horse straight into the black wall, bearing down on them both. This is the story of Talila and Rhett Calder, of a storm that should have ended a life and instead began 2 new ones. Stories like theirs take real work to make right. Tap join beside the channel name and become a channel member, and let's ride back into the hour the sky first turned to iron. Rhett Calder had been on that trail since before sunup, pushing his last 23 head of steer south along the dry wash toward the rail spur at Cottonwood Flat, and he had known since noon that the sky owed him nothing good. The morning had opened clear and hard-lit, the way desert mornings did in the last weeks before the summer monsoon broke. But by early afternoon, a smudge had crept along the whole southern horizon, low and brown and wrong. The kind of color a man who had ranched this stretch of the Arizona Territory for 6 years learned to read the way other men read weather in a church bell. He had a note coming due at the Territorial Bank in 11 days, a ranch his father had scraped out of rock and stubbornness called split rock, and these 23 steers were the difference between making that note and losing everything the old man had built. He was 31 years old, unmarried, broad through the shoulders from a decade of fence work, and short on patience for anything that threatened to cost him this land, and he pushed the herd harder than he ought to have, because 11 days was 11 days, and the bank did not care what the sky was doing. Rhett had not always ridden this land alone. His father, Silas Calder, had walked this stretch of the Arizona Territory on foot the year before the railroad ever reached Tucson, staking out 400 acres of scrub and rock that every other man in the valley had called worthless, and had built Split Rock up from a single-line shack into a working cattle operation through sheer bull-headed refusal to fail at it. His mother had died of a fever the winter Rhett turned 9, and Silas had never remarried, raising a son alone on land that demanded everything a man had and gave back exactly what he could wring from it and not $1 more. Silas himself had passed only 2 winters back, leaving Rhett the ranch, the debt, and a 2-man crew loyal enough to stay through a run of thin years. And though Rhett carried his own share of grief buried in that same hard ground, he had never once let himself resent the inheritance. He simply understood. Riding south with his last 23 head under a sky going wrong, that losing Split Rock now would mean losing the last plain proof that his father's whole stubborn life had actually amounted to something. By the time he understood what that brown smudge actually was, it was already too late to simply turn around and outrun it. It came on faster than any storm he had ever watched, the whole southern world folding itself into a rolling black curtain 1,000 feet high, swallowing the mountains first and then the mesquite flats and then the light itself. And Rhett had exactly enough time to get his steers bunched and turned before the wind hit like a fist, and the world went the color of a closed fist. He had heard old-timers talk about storms like this, haboobs, some called them, a wall of dust thrown up ahead of a collapsing thunderhead, capable of burying a wagon or blinding a man 20 feet from his own front door. He had never seen one close enough to touch. He was about to. He got the herd into a rough huddle against a low outcrop of rock, tied his own bandana up over his nose and mouth, and was working his way along the line checking for strays when his horse threw its head up hard and refused to go another step, ears pinned flat. A stubbornness that cut straight through the roaring wind and the sand already stinging every inch of exposed skin. Rhett followed the animal's line of sight into the churning brown dark, and saw for one heartbeat before the dust swallowed it again, a shape moving where nothing should have been moving, upright, staggering, arms out in front like a woman walking blind through a burning house. He did not decide to go. He was already moving before the thought finished forming, spurring his horse straight off the shelter of the rock and into the full teeth of the storm, sand driving into his eyes hard enough to draw blood. The world reduced to a churning brown nothing with no up and no down and no way to judge distance, except the diminishing hope that he had not simply imagined a person out here at all. He nearly lost her twice, the wind screaming loud enough to swallow his own shouting, and then his horse nearly trampled the dark shape crumpled half over the body of a dead horse, sand already drifting against its flank in dunes an hour old could not have built, and Rhett threw himself down out of the saddle and got both arms around a woman who had stopped in that last moment before he reached her, trying to walk at all. She fought him for one wild half-second, some deep animal instinct refusing to be seized by anything in a storm that had already taken her horse and nearly taken her sight. And then her body simply gave out against him, exhausted, past the point where fighting made any sense. He felt, even through the chaos of wind and grit, the fierce and deliberate way she kept one arm locked across her own chest, guarding something wrapped in deerskin pressed hard against her ribs, refusing to let it go, even as every other part of her surrendered to him completely. He did not have time to wonder what it was. He had time only to get her up in front of him on the saddle, turn the horse's tail to the worst of the wind, and ride for the only shelter he knew within reach, a narrow cleft in the rock, a half-mile east, where a flash flood years back had split the mesa wall clean in two. They made it inside with the storm screaming a foot behind them, and Rhett dragged her deep enough into the cleft that the rock itself broke the worst of the wind, dropped his own bedroll and slicker over her shaking shoulders, and turned his horse's rump into the gap behind them to block what the rock could not. The roar outside did not lessen. If anything had built, the whole narrow crack in the mesa filling with a sound like a locomotive that never finished passing. Hour after hour, the light beyond the entrance gone, the deep brown black of a photograph left too long in developer fluid. Rhett had never in his life felt so completely at the mercy of weather, and he understood, sitting with his back against cold stone and a total stranger breathing hard beside him, that they were not walking out of this cleft again until the sky decided to let them. She did not speak for a long while, and Rhett did not push her to. He watched her instead, in the thin gray light leaking through the cleft's mouth, cataloging what he could see. A young woman, no older than her early 20s, dark hair worked loose from its braid and thick with dust, a doeskin dress torn at one shoulder, and that bundle, wrapped tight in oiled deerskin and lashed with sino, that she kept pulled against her body even now, even exhausted, even safe for the moment, inside stone walls, as though the storm itself might reach in and take it from her if she let her guard down for one careless second. "You're safe here," Rhett said, finally, pitching his voice low to carry under the wind's roar without shouting. "Storm will blow itself out. Might be a while yet." She studied him a long moment before answering, dark eyes sharp and assessing even through the exhaustion, the particular wariness of someone who had learned, likely at real cost, that a stranger's calm voice meant nothing about a stranger's intentions. "You rode into that," she said at last, not quite a question, her own voice carrying the flattened vowels of a woman more comfortable in another tongue entirely. "For someone you did not know. Didn't much like the alternative." He shrugged out of his heavier coat and held it toward her, careful to leave a full arm's length of space between them. "Name's Rhett Calder. I run cattle 2 miles east of here, or I did until about an hour ago." She took the coat, though she did not immediately put it on, and did not offer her own name in return, and Rhett understood well enough not to ask twice. He built what fire he could from the dry brush wedged into cracks of the rock, more for the comfort of light than any real warmth against the heat still trapped in the stone, and settled in for what promised to be a very long night sharing. 8 feet of narrow rock with a woman who had not decided yet whether he was a rescuer or simply the newest danger in. A very bad day. The storm did not relent with darkness. If anything, the night made it worse, an endless roaring black that swallowed every sound but itself, sand hissing into every fold of their shelter, no matter how Rhett angled the horse in the slicker to block it. And somewhere, past what he judged to be midnight, the young woman finally spoke again. Her guard worn down by exhaustion, past the point where silence served her any longer. "Talila," she said it quietly, testing the sound of her own name in this stranger's presence the way a person tests ice before trusting their full weight to it. "My name is Talila." Rhett turned the name over with the same careful respect she had given his. "Where were you headed? Out here alone?" Her jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought she would retreat back into silence entirely. But something in the long black hours already shared between them, or perhaps simply the exhaustion of holding a secret alone through a storm like this one, loosened her tongue instead. "I was not alone. Chody rode with me. My uncle, a headman among my people, a man who had crossed 3 armies and outlived every one of them." Her hand tightened unconsciously on the deerskin bundle in her lap. "3 days ago, riders came on us before dawn while we watered the horses at a seep east of the dragoons. They shot him from his saddle before either of us understood men were even near. I rode 2 days with almost no water, and today the sky itself decided to try finishing what those men started." Rhett went very still. "Who were they?" "The riders." "Freight men, Draeger men." She spat the name like something bitter caught between her teeth. "Emmett Draeger runs the freight line out of Cottonwood Flat, and for 3 months his men have been hauling wagon loads of rock salt out to Antelope Spring under cover of darkness and dumping it straight into the water my people have drunk from since before your grandfathers crossed this ocean of a country. My uncle discovered why. He stole the proof of it from Draeger's own freight office, a ledger, a survey map, a letter in Draeger's own hand, and we were riding to San Carlos to put it in the Indian agent's hands before Draeger could file his water claim on land my people will have already abandoned as poisoned and undrinkable." She looked at the bundle in her lap, and then, for the first time, directly at Rhett, some private calculation moving behind her eyes. "This is what I would rather have died than let that storm take from me. This is what got my uncle killed." Rhett sat with that a long moment, feeling the shape of the danger she had just handed him settle into his chest like a stone. Salting a live spring to force people off land they've a right to, and then filing a water claim on the empty ground. He shook his head slowly. "That's not just cruelty. Man could hang for that if it ever saw a judge." "If it ever saw a judge." Talila's voice carried a bitterness that had clearly been earned the hard way, over years rather than days. "Draeger has friends on the territorial bench and money enough to buy the rest. The only thing that frightens men like him is proof so plain even his friends cannot bury it. That is what I carry. That is why 3 of his riders were willing to murder an old man at a water seep in the dark." She met Rhett's eyes squarely. "And why, if his men learn I survived that ambush, they will not stop hunting until they find me." Rhett looked at the bundle, and then at the young woman guarding it with the same fierce, exhausted resolve she must have carried across 2 waterless days and a killing storm, and felt something shift in his own chest, not quite the plain decency that had sent him riding into the dust after a stranger. A kind of anger on her behalf. He had no business feeling for a woman he had known scarcely half a day. Well, he fed another piece of brush into the small fire, watching it catch. "Storm's not done with us yet, and neither, sounds like, is Draeger. Reckon we've got some time to figure out what comes next." She studied him again in the firelight, the same searching, cataloging look she had given him, back at the moment he first pulled her against the dead horse, and whatever she found in his face this time seemed to satisfy some private measure a fraction further than it had before. "You did not have to ride into that storm for a stranger." "No," Rhett agreed. "I didn't. Why did you?" He considered the question longer than she likely expected. "Guess I figured I'd rather lose the whole herd than spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have saved somebody and didn't try." He looked over at her, firelight catching the dust still crusted along her jaw. "Same reason I'll help you get that bundle to San Carlos, if you'll let me. Don't reckon a woman ought to carry a thing like that alone across country, crawling with men who already killed once to stop it." Talila did not answer right away, weighing his offer the way she had clearly learned to weigh everything a stranger offered her, for the cost hidden inside it, for what he might expect returned. "I do not know you, Rhett Calder." "No," he said again, "but you've got a day and a night of storm left to decide whether that's a problem, and I'm not going anywhere." The hours that followed the storm's worst hour settled into something almost companionable, despite everything stacked against it, the roar outside gradually losing its worst edge as the night wore toward its coldest, deepest hour, and Talila, perhaps out of exhaustion or perhaps out of some slow-building decision, began to talk not about Draeger, not yet, but about smaller things. The particular way her people read weather in the color of a sunset over the Chiricahua Mountains, the story her grandmother told about Ussen shaping the first spring from a crack in solid rock as a gift never meant to be poisoned by anyone. Rhett listened more than he spoke, understanding somewhere in that long dark hour that he was being tested, as much as comforted, that every small, true thing she offered him was itself a kind of ledger she was keeping, weighing whether this rancher who had ridden into a killing storm was worth trusting with anything larger than a night's shelter. She told him, too, of the Gan, the mountain spirit dancers who moved through her people's ceremonies in tall wooden headdresses, meant to call down protection when the world turned dangerous, and of the way her own mother had taught her more than plants, teaching her letters as well. Traded quietly from a mission school primer, years before any reservation line had been drawn around her family, so that a Chiricahua girl might read a white man's ledger as easily as she read the sky before a storm. It was that same reading, Talila admitted quietly, that had let her understand exactly what Chody had carried out of Draeger's office within an hour of him bringing it to her, not just theft, but evidence, plain enough in black ink that no territorial judge friendly to freight money could pretend not to see it if it ever reached the right hands. Rhett listened to all of it without once treating her knowledge as a curiosity to be marveled at rather than simply respected, and somewhere in that telling, Talila understood she had crossed a quiet, private line she had not fully intended to cross this early. She had begun despite every hard lesson 18 months of loss had taught her. To trust this particular stranger with more of herself than mere shelter required. Dawn came gray and strange, the storm finally spending itself some time before first light and leaving behind a world scoured raw, dunes of fine sand, piled against every rock and fence post for a mile in every direction, the sky washed a pale, exhausted blue. Rhett's steers had scattered, but not by some mercy died, and he spent the better part of the morning gathering what he could, while Talila watched from the cleft's mouth, still weak from 2 days without proper water, the deerskin bundle never once out of arm's reach. By midday he had made a decision. He did not bother running past anyone but himself. "Split Rock's 2 miles from here," he told her, swinging up onto his horse and offering a hand down to her. "You need water, food, and a few days you're not walking anywhere on legs that near gave out on you yesterday. After that, we'll see about San Carlos." She looked at his offered hand a long moment, the same weighing calculation he had come to recognize as simply the way she moved through a world that had given her very little reason to trust it, and then she took it, letting him pull her up onto the horse in front of him for the ride back to his ranch. I do not have money to pay for your hospitality, Rhett Calder. Didn't ask for any. He turned the horse toward Split Rock. Figure, saving your life once already puts me behind on the accounting, not ahead. Split Rock Ranch sat low against a shoulder of red rock 2 miles east, a modest spread of adobe and split timber that had clearly known better years. And the 2 ranch hands Rhett kept on, an older man named Gus and a quiet, younger one called Boyd, met their arrival with the particular stiff caution of men unused to their boss riding in with an Apache woman across his saddle. Rhett did not explain himself beyond the barest facts, and something in the set of his jaw discouraged either man from pressing further. Though Gus's eyes followed Talila with a wariness she noticed immediately and filed away without comment, exactly the way she had learned to file every reaction a stranger's face gave her. Water that Rhett Calder had ridden home with an Apache woman spread through Cottonwood Flat within days, the way any unusual thing did in a town small enough that every wagon's business became everyone's business by supper time, and not every version of the story making its rounds was kind. Some folks simply shrugged it off as a rancher's private affair. Others, particularly those who had lost stock or kin to raids further south a decade back and had never fully separated one Apache band from another in their own reckoning, muttered that Calder had lost his sense taking in a woman of a people they still counted as enemies regardless of what year the treaties claimed the fighting had ended. Rhett heard enough of it secondhand, from Gus and from the postmaster, and from the particular chill in a few neighbors' greetings, to understand that sheltering Talila had cost him something, in the town's good opinion even before Draeger's men ever rode out to collect on it, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he minded the loss of that good opinion a good deal less than he would have minded losing her. The days that followed fell into a careful, watchful rhythm neither of them had planned for. Talila's body needed real time to recover from 2 days without water and a night spent half frozen and terrified in a stone cleft, and Rhett gave her that time without demanding anything in return, tending the fire, bringing food to the small room off the kitchen he had cleared out for her, and otherwise leaving her the dignity of healing on her own schedule rather than his. She noticed, the way she noticed everything, that he never once tried to touch her beyond what the emergency of that first ride had required, that he knocked before entering any room where she rested, that his eyes held a careful, respectful distance even when curiosity plainly burned behind them. She counted these small things into the private ledger she had learned. Over years of living on land, other people claimed the right to decide who belonged on it, to keep on every stranger who crossed her path. By the 4th day she was strong enough to be useful around the ranch, and being useful, she discovered again, as she had discovered many times before in many other places, was a far more comfortable position to occupy than being a burden a stranger's charity had to carry indefinitely. She moved through Rhett's kitchen with a quiet, exacting competence that surprised him, mending a torn seam with stitches finer than his own clumsy attempts, catching a smoking flue before he noticed the smell himself, working a poultice from plants she gathered along the wash against the raw chapping the wind and sand had left on both their hands. Rhett watched her prepare it one evening with open, unguarded curiosity. He made no effort to hide. "My grandmother taught my mother, and my mother taught me," Talila said, not looking up from the 2 flat stones. She used to grind the dried leaves. "Fine. This plant, your people call creosote. We have used it against fever and wound rot longer than your soldiers have had a name for this territory at all." There was no anger in the words, only a flat, unshakable certainty, and Rhett, to his credit, did not argue or dismiss it, only asked what she called it in her own tongue, and listened to the answer, as though he genuinely wanted it, rather than simply enduring a lesson. Talila found herself, for the first time in longer than she cared to count, explaining something true about her people to a white man who seemed to actually want to understand, rather than merely tolerate the telling. That was how the wariness between them began, slowly to thaw, not in one dramatic turn, but in 100 small ones, each a tiny brick laid into a wall neither of them had set out to build. Rhett learned that the woman he had pulled from a dead horse's side was, underneath the exhaustion of that first week, sharp-eyed, capable, and entirely unwilling to be treated as anyone's charity case a moment longer than strict necessity demanded. Talila learned that the rancher who had ridden into a killing storm for a total stranger asked for nothing in return. He had not already given freely first, and that his quiet, careful distance was not indifference, but something closer to respect offered. She taught him one quiet evening to say "Ashoge, thank you," and laughed, a real and unguarded sound he had not yet heard from her, at the careful, overly formal way he pronounced it back to her the first 4 times before he finally got the shape of it right. "You say it like a man reciting scripture," she told him, not unkindly. "It is a small word. It does not need to be handled so carefully." "Everything about you so far has needed handling carefully," Rhett said. "Reckon the habit's hard to break." She looked at him a long moment after that, something warm and unguarded moving behind her eyes that had nothing to do with caution at all, and did not immediately look away. One evening, not long after, Talila found Rhett sitting alone on the porch step watching a sky gone the deep, star-crowded black particular to the high desert, and settled beside him without asking permission or waiting for an invitation, a small thing that would have been unthinkable between them only a week before. They sat a long while in a silence that had stopped feeling like caution and started feeling like something closer to company. "My grandmother used to say, the stars were the campfires of every person who walked this land before us, still burning long after the person who lit them was gone," Talila said eventually, tipping her head back toward the sky. "I have always found that a comfort on nights when the ground beneath me did not feel like it belonged to anyone at all." Rhett considered that a long moment. "Never had much use for comfort like that before," he admitted. "Reckon I might be finding some now." Neither of them moved to close the small distance, still sitting between them on that porch step, but neither of them moved away from it, either, and both of them understood, without needing to name it aloud, that something had quietly finished changing shape between her rescuer and the woman he had pulled from a dead horse's side 3 weeks before. 12 days into her recovery, Rhett rode into Cottonwood Flat for supplies, and Talila, restless after so many days confined to the ranch, went with him against her own better judgment, her hair bound back and a borrowed hat pulled low, hoping to pass through the small frontier town unremarked. She did not pass through unremarked. A shopkeeper's wife, sweeping her own front step, went rigid at the sight of her, and 2 men loading crates outside the freight office, Draeger's freight office, Talila realized, with a cold jolt the moment she read the painted sign, went very still in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary town suspicion. If you want more stories like this one, tap join beside the channel name and become a member. It truly helps keep them coming. She did not flinch under the freight men's stares, though her pulse had gone loud in her own ears, and she did not look to Rhett to fight a battle she had learned, across years of exactly this kind of small and large cruelty, to fight for herself with her spine straight and her chin level. She held the nearer man's gaze until he was the one who looked away first, and walked on into the mercantile as though his eyes had never touched her at all, though inside she understood with cold clarity that word of a surviving witness would reach Emmett Draeger before sundown. Inside the mercantile, the shopkeeper himself hesitated, overserving her, at all glancing twice toward the freight office window before ringing up her purchases, and it was Talila who broke the small standoff, setting her coin plainly on the counter and speaking in the same level, unhurried voice she used on every stranger who ever doubted her right to stand where she stood. "I have coin same as any customer, and I mean to spend it same as any customer." Something in her flat certainty seemed to embarrass the man more than any argument could have, because he rang up the sale without another word of hesitation. She had learned, across 18 months of exactly this kind of small friction, that dignity was not a thing other people granted her. It was a thing she simply refused, every time, to set down. "Rhett, a step behind her, had caught the whole exchange, and his jaw had gone tight enough to ache by the time they reached the mercantile counter. "Those were Draeger's men," he said quietly, once they were alone enough not to be overheard. "They knew you. They know what I might be carrying, more than they know my face." Talila kept her own voice level, though her hand had found the edge of the counter and gripped it. "We should not have come to town together. It was a mistake, and it is my mistake to own, not yours. Wasn't only your choice to make." Rhett's voice had gone low and hard in a way she had not heard from him before. "You're under my roof. That makes it my business, too, whether you like the shape of that or not." She studied him a long moment, some old wariness warring visibly with something newer and more complicated. "I do not need a man to fight my battles for me, Rhett Calder. I have carried worse than a few ugly stairs across 100 miles of open country. Didn't say you needed rescuing." He met her eyes steady. Said, "It's my business now, too. There's a difference, and I mean to respect it, but I'm not pretending I don't see the danger sitting plain in front of both of us." They rode back to Split Rock, mostly in silence, the easy morning replaced by a tension neither of them named aloud, and that same evening word reached Cottonwood Flats freight office exactly the way Talila had feared it would. Emmett Draeger, a heavy-set man with cold, pale eyes, and a reputation for buying whatever the law could not otherwise be persuaded to overlook, heard from his own men that the Apache girl who should have died in the desert alongside her uncle was instead alive and sheltering at a rancher's spread 2 miles east, still carrying, by every reasonable assumption, the ledger and letter his own careless clerk had let go. Missing from the freight office 3 months before, Draeger did not waste time on subtlety once he understood the shape of the danger facing him. He sent word to the 4 riders he trusted most, the same 4 who had put a bullet through an old headman at a water seep in the dark, with instructions simple enough not to be misunderstood. Find the girl, find the bundle, and leave nothing behind that could testify against either. Draeger had not built a freight line worth $40,000 by leaving matters to chance, and even as he dispatched his 4 best riders east toward Split Rock, he set a second plan quietly into motion in Cottonwood Flat itself. He called on Judge Harlan Voss, a man whose gambling debts Draeger had quietly settled more than once over the years, and suggested, in the mild, reasonable tone he used for every threat he ever made, that should any wild story ever reach town about an Apache woman carrying stolen freight company papers, the judge might find it a simple matter to have her arrested first, on whatever charge came conveniently to hand, before anyone troubled themselves reading what she carried. It was, Draeger reflected, watching his riders vanish into the heat shimmer of the wash, always cheaper to own the law than to fight it, and he intended to be holding both approaches in hand by the time this particular problem finally exhausted itself. Rhett learned the shape of that danger 2 days later from Gus, who had ridden into Cottonwood Flat for wire and come back with more than he had gone for. "Whole town's talking about it," the older hand said, low enough that Talila, working in the garden a stone's throw off, would not hear. "Draeger's putting a bounty out, quiet-like, for information on an Apache woman traveling alone. $50 and no questions asked about what happens after she's found." Gus's eyes cut toward the garden and back. "You ought to know what you're keeping under this roof, boss. Man, that size doesn't spend $50 on a woman he means to talk to politely." Rhett found Talila that evening turning the deerskin bundle over in her hands by the last of the daylight, and understood, watching her, that she had already reached the same conclusion Gus had voiced to him that afternoon. "You heard," she said, not quite a question before he had said a word. "I heard." Rhett sat down across from her, close enough to speak low. $50 is a serious sum for a man to spend quiet. Means he's scared of exactly what you're carrying, and scared men don't stop hunting. Then I should not stay here any longer than I already have. Talila's voice was steady, though something beneath it had gone raw. Every day I remain under your roof is a day you and your men stand in the path of something that has already cost one life. I did not come here to bring that danger down on people who owe me nothing. You didn't bring it. Draeger brought it. The day he decided poisoning a spring was cheaper than paying honest freight rates. Rhett held her eyes. I told you back in that storm I'd help you get this to San Carlos, and I meant it. Running you off alone into country crawling with men looking to collect $50 off your corpse isn't help. It's cowardice, wearing a polite word. Talila studied him a long moment in the fading light, and something in her had clearly shifted since the cleft, since the kitchen, since the walk through a hostile town, with her spine straight and her chin level, while he stood silently furious a step behind her. You would risk your ranch, your men, your own life, for people you have known 3 weeks. Didn't say I'd known them 3 weeks. Rhett's voice had gone quieter, something more honest, working its way into it than either of them had allowed the conversation before now. Said I'd known you 3 weeks, and in 3 weeks you've shown me more plain courage than I've seen in most men twice your age. Reckon that's worth a risk or two. She did not answer that directly, though. Something in her face softened in a way Rhett had not seen from her before, and later that night, unable to sleep with the shape of Draeger's $50 bounty sitting heavy in the house, she found him still awake by the bank kitchen fire, and sat across from him without a word. Comfortable silence that said more than either of them had yet found the courage to put into speech. It was Talila who finally broke it. The legal threat arrived 2 days later, in the shape of a Cottonwood Flat deputy named Purdy, riding out to Split Rock, with a warrant signed by Judge Harlan Voss himself, charging one unnamed Apache woman with the theft of freight company property. Rhett read the paper twice at his own front gate, his jaw working, before he handed it back to the deputy with a flat, deliberate calm he did not entirely feel. Warrant doesn't name her. Purdy doesn't name anybody. You want to arrest a woman off a blank line and a freight man say, so you're going to need considerably more than this before I let you past my own gate. Purdy, plainly uncomfortable with the whole errand, shifted in his saddle. Judge signed it. Mr. Calder Draeger swore the complaint himself. Says she's got stolen ledgers on her. Man can swear out whatever complaint he likes. Doesn't make it true? And it surely doesn't make it your business to search my property on a warrant that doesn't name a soul. Talila, watching from the doorway, understood exactly what game Draeger was playing even before Rhett finished refusing the deputy at the gate. A legal cover, thin as it was, that would let Draeger's men search Split Rock for the very evidence that could hang him, dressed up as ordinary law enforcement rather than the theft it actually was. Purdy rode back to town empty-handed, plainly relieved to be quit of the whole uncomfortable errand, but the warrant itself did not simply vanish, and both Rhett and Talila understood that Draeger had bought himself a legal excuse he intended to use again, likely with deputies less troubled by conscience than Purdy had shown himself to be. He is trying 2 doors at once, Talila said quietly, once the deputy's dust had settled on the road. The law, and then, when the law moves too slow for his liking, the men who shot Jody. Then we'd best get you to San Carlos before he tries either door again, Rhett said, and this time, neither of them argued about whose business the danger truly was. That night, once Talila had gone to rest and the ranch had gone quiet around him, Rhett sat a long while turning the whole tangled shape of the danger over in his mind. A freight man with money enough to buy a judge, 4 riders already proven willing to kill, and a woman under his roof who had trusted him with a truth large enough to get them both killed twice over. He could have ridden into Cottonwood Flat himself and demanded the marshal act on his own account, could have sent Talila on alone toward San Carlos and washed his hands of a danger that was not strictly his to carry. He did neither, and understood, sitting alone by his own banked fire, that the decision had stopped being a decision at all somewhere between the storm and the kitchen and the porch step under a sky full of old campfires. He was not protecting a stranger any longer. He was protecting the woman he had, without quite noticing the exact hour it happened, fallen in love with. My people call this land Chiricahua country because our name for the mountains means something like Great Mountain, though your maps have never once asked us what to call anything before deciding a name for it themselves. She looked into the fire rather than at him. I have watched my people be pushed smaller and smaller across land we have lived on since before memory keeps a clear count of years. Antelope Spring is one of the last waters left to us that no agency, no treaty, no white court has yet decided to take. If Draeger poisons it and claims the empty ground after, there will be nothing left for my band but San Carlos, and San Carlos has already swallowed more of my people than I can bear to count. She turned to look at him fully, then, firelight catching something fierce and unguarded in her dark eyes. That is what I am carrying, Rhett Calder, not just a ledger, the last water my people have left to call their own. Rhett sat with the full weight of that a long moment before he spoke. Then we get it to San Carlos, and we get it there before Draeger's men find you first. He held her gaze. That's not charity talking. That's just what a person does when they understand what's actually at stake. Something passed between them in that fire-lit quiet that neither of them named aloud, though both of them felt its shape settle into the room like a third presence. And it was in that same hour, some days later, when a rider came pounding up the Split Rock Road at a dead run with word that changed everything at once. Boyd, the quieter of Rhett's two hands, had ridden out that morning to check the north fence line and come back white-faced and half-frantic, his horse lathered from a hard run. Riders, he got out before he was fully off the horse. 4 of them, coming up the wash from Cottonwood Flat, moving slow and quiet the way men move when they don't want to be heard coming. I recognized one. Rides for Draeger's outfit. Boss, I think they know she's here. Rhett did not waste time on questions. How long? Hour, maybe less. Talila was already on her feet, the bundle gathered against her chest with the same fierce instinct that had carried her through 2 waterless days in a killing storm. I will not let them find that proof in this house. If I ride out now alone, they follow me and leave your men out of it. No. Rhett's voice cut flat and final in a way that ended the argument before it fully began. You ride out alone into open country with 4 armed men. An hour behind you, you're dead before dark, and Draeger walks free to poison every spring left in this territory. That's not a trade I'm willing to make. He was already moving toward the gun rack over the mantel as he spoke, checking the loads on a rifle that had not seen real use since his father's day. Gus, get the horses into the box canyon behind the barn and keep them quiet. Boyd, you're with me at the front. Talila, I am not hiding while you fight my battle for me, Rhett Calder. She met his eyes with a fierceness that stopped him mid-sentence. I have carried a rifle since I was 12 years old. I will not stand behind a wall while 4 men who murdered my uncle come to finish what they started. He studied her a long moment, some argument dying in his throat before it fully formed, and understood, looking at the set of her jaw, that he was looking at exactly the same courage that had carried her out of a killing storm on her own 2 feet. Fine, he said finally. But you keep that bundle wrapped and hidden the second shooting starts, and you trust me to watch your flank the way I trust you to watch mine. Deal. Deal, Talila said, and there was something almost like the beginning of a smile in it, grim and fierce and entirely unafraid. The 4 riders came up the wash exactly as Boyd had warned, moving with the deliberate quiet of men who believed they held every advantage, surprise, numbers, and a target they assumed would be unarmed and undefended. What they found instead was Rhett Calder positioned behind the low adobe wall at the front of his own house, with a rifle steadied and ready, Boyd covering the barn approach, and Talila crouched at the corner of the porch, with a borrowed carbine held with the easy competence of someone who had told the plain truth about learning to shoot young. That's far enough. Rhett's voice carried clear across the yard, hard and unhurried. You're on Split Rock land, and you've got exactly 1 chance to turn around before this gets a great deal worse for all 4 of you. The lead rider, a lean man with a scarred jaw that Talila recognized instantly as one of the men from the ambush at the water seep, laughed without any real humor in it. "We're not here for you, rancher. Send the girl out with whatever she's carrying, and you keep your ranch and your life both. She's not for sale, and neither's what she's carrying." Rhett's rifle did not waver. "You murdered an old man in the dark for it. Reckon you'll have to murder me too in daylight in front of 2 witnesses if you mean to try collecting today." The scarred rider's hand moved toward his own weapon, and the yard exploded into gunfire before either side had finished speaking. The sharp crack of Rhett's rifle answered almost instantly by shots from the other 3, dust kicking up along the adobe wall inches from where he crouched. Talila's carbine spoke a half-second later, steady and controlled, despite the chaos, and one of the rider's horses reared hard enough to throw its rider clear before the man had fired a single shot. Boyd's rifle caught a second rider from the barn side, and for one long, ringing moment, the whole yard seemed to hold its breath in the gunsmoke. It was the scarred rider, Draeger's most trusted man, and the one who had killed Chody at the water seep without a second thought, who pressed the hardest, spurring his horse straight at the low wall where Rhett knelt, reloading, pistol leveled, and murder plain in his face. Talila saw it a half-second before Rhett did, and did not hesitate. She put herself into the gap at the corner of the porch and fired, and the scarred rider went down hard off his horse, 10 feet from where Rhett crouched, the fight going out of the remaining 2 men all at once. The last 2 riders wheeled and ran, leaving one of their own bleeding in the yard, and another already fled on foot into the mesquite, and the sudden silence after all that gunfire rang louder in Rhett's ears than the shooting itself had. He crossed the yard at a dead run to where Talila still knelt at the porch corner, carbine steady in her hands, breathing hard but entirely unhurt, and something in his chest came apart with relief so total it nearly buckled his knees. "You're all right?" It was not quite a question. "I am all right." Talila lowered the carbine slowly, her own hands not quite steady now that the fight had passed. "You are bleeding." Rhett looked down and found, with some surprise, a graze along his forearm he had not felt land at all in the heat of it. "Reckon that'll keep." He looked at her, close enough now that neither of them stepped back the way careful distance had always dictated before. "You saved my life just now. You saved mine first in a storm neither of us had any business surviving." Talila's dark eyes held his, something unguarded finally showing through the wariness she had carried since the moment he first pulled her against her dead horse. "I think we are past the accounting of who owes whom," Rhett Calder. Neither of them moved to close the last small distance between them, not yet, not with a wounded man groaning in the yard, and Draeger's remaining reach still very much a live danger, but something had shifted between them in that yard that would not shift back, and both of them understood it plainly, even without saying so aloud. By the time the last of the gunsmoke cleared, Boyd had already ridden hard for the territorial marshal's office, and it was well past midnight before Marshal Otis Greer arrived at Split Rock with 2 deputies to take the wounded rider into custody and hear the full accounting of what had happened in that yard. Greer was an older man, careful and unhurried in the way of lawmen who had seen enough frontier trouble to distrust easy stories, and he listened to Rhett's account and then, with a courtesy that plainly surprised her, to Talila's own telling of the ambush at the water seep and everything Draeger's men had done since, writing it all down in a notebook he handled like it mattered. "I've had my own suspicions about Draeger's outfit for the better part of a year," Greer admitted, before he left with his prisoner and Boyd's help carrying the scarred rider's body into town. "Never had proof enough to move on it. Reckon that's about to change." They rode for San Carlos 3 days later, once Rhett's arm had been properly dressed and the surviving captured rider had been handed over to the territorial marshal with a full confession that named Emmett Draeger plainly as the man who had ordered both the ambush at the water seep and the attempted murder at Split Rock. The confession alone might have been enough to hang the man eventually, but it was the bundle Talila carried, the ledger in Draeger's own clerk's hand, the survey map marking Antelope Spring inside the exact boundary he meant to claim, and the letter bearing Draeger's own signature ordering the salt delivered under cover of darkness. That Indian agent Cyrus Whitfield read through twice in his San Carlos office with an expression that told Talila, watching him closely, that this time the proof was plain enough, even a friendly territorial bench would struggle to bury it. The ride to San Carlos had not been without its own tension. 3 long days across country that offered Draeger's remaining reach ample opportunity to try again, and on the second afternoon, a party of 6 mounted Chiricahua scouts fell in around them so quietly that Rhett had his rifle half raised before Talila's sharp words stopped him. She spoke with the lead scout in her own tongue for the better part of a minute, and Rhett watched something in the men's postures ease from wary readiness into plain relief the moment they understood who she was and whose granddaughter she had once played beside as a child. "They have been watching the roads for me since word of the ambush reached the foothills," Talila explained, once the scouts had turned to ride escort rather than block their path. "My uncle was known and respected far beyond our own band. They mean to see us safely the rest of the way." Rhett rode the final day to San Carlos, surrounded by armed Chiricahua riders who trusted him only exactly as far as Talila's word vouched for him and understood, watching the easy, wordless communication passing between the scouts and the woman beside him, that he was witnessing a whole world of loyalty and kinship that had existed long before he ever rode into a storm and found her inside it. "This is exactly what's needed," Whitfield told her, setting the ledger down with real gravity in his voice. "Your uncle understood precisely what he was risking to get this out of that office, Miss Talila, and I intend to see it carried. All the way to the territorial governor, if that's what it takes to see Draeger answer for both the poisoning and the 2 lives he's cost already. Antelope Spring stays your people's water. I'll see to that personally." Something in Talila's shoulders eased in a way Rhett had not seen since the night in the stone cleft, a weight she had carried across 100 miles and 2 brushes with death finally set down in hands that meant to honor it properly, and she looked over at Rhett with an expression that held equal parts exhaustion and something warmer. Something that had been building quietly between the two of them since a storm first threw them together in a place neither had chosen. Emmett Draeger was arrested inside the week, the ledger and letter proving more than sufficient once a territorial judge with less patience for buried evidence than his usual friends looked over the whole plain case, and Antelope Spring was ordered cleared and protected under federal water rights that no freight company would trouble again for salting. One of it traveled fast through Cottonwood Flat, and faster still through the Chiricahua band scattered across the foothills, and within a month, Talila's own father and younger brother, both of whom she had feared lost, or worse, across the 18 months since the Army first scattered her family's winter camp, drawn into Split Rock, with word that the whole story of the rancher who rode into a killing storm and the young woman who carried her people's water safely home had already become something told around more than one fire. Telling a story like this one properly takes real work. Tap join beside the channel name and become a member and help make sure stories worth telling keep getting made. Rhett and Talila married the following spring in a small ceremony that honored both her people's ways and his, held at Split Rock under a sky gone the same pale washed blue it had shone the morning after the storm that first threw them together, with her father and brother restored and running clear again, only a half-day's ride from where they built their life together. The ceremony blended traditions with quiet care rather than compromise. Talila's aunt sang the old blessing songs her own mother had once sung. A woven basket of ceremonial corn passed hand to hand among the gathered guests, and Rhett, coached patiently for a week beforehand by Talila's father, carefully practiced Chiricahua before he spoke them again in English, a gesture that visibly moved more than one of her relatives standing witness. Talila wore alongside a doeskin dress her aunt, had beaded new for the occasion, a small locket that had belonged to Rhett's own mother, a detail neither family had planned but that both, discovering it together that morning, agreed suited the day perfectly. In the years that followed, Split Rock became something of a rare place along that stretch of the territory, a working cattle ranch where Chiricahua relatives came and went as freely as any neighbor, where Talila's father taught Rhett enough of the language to greet his own in-laws properly, and where more than one Apache family, driven off harder ground elsewhere, found honest work and a fair wage as the ranch grew past what 2 hands and a rancher's stubbornness alone could manage. Cottonwood Flat took longer to come around than Talila's own family had, but even there, the story of the rancher who rode into a killing storm and the water he had helped save eventually did more good than a decade of quieter prejudice had done harm, and by the time their first daughter was born, the same shopkeeper's wife, who had once gone rigid at the sight of Talila in her doorway, brought over a blanket she had sewn herself, and stayed long enough to hold the child. Talila never did stop keeping her private ledger of small, true things a person offered without being asked, though these days the column she filled fastest belonged entirely to her husband. The careful distance he had given her recovery, the rifle he had trusted her to carry into a gunfight. Quote, the ranch he had risked without a second thought for a stranger's cause that had, in the end, become entirely his own. Rhett, for his part, never did forget the sight of a woman walking blind through a wall of storm dust rather than let go of what she carried, and he came to understand, across a long and good marriage, that he had not merely saved a life that black afternoon on the trail to Cottonwood Flat. He had found the one person on earth stubborn and brave enough to match him, step for step, through anything, a storm, or a man like Draeger, or the whole hard country around them, ever thought to throw in their path.